Riversend, Pennsylvania, is a typical American town with a population of just over 15,000. Once prosperous thanks to the textile industry, today it survives mainly thanks to a minimum security women's correctional facility located on the outskirts. Riversend Correctional Facility provides jobs for about 300 local residents. That's almost 1 in 10 working-age townspeople. On Tuesday, November 7th, 2023, at 5:43 a.m., prison guard Carl Dawson discovered the body of 35-year-old inmate Ellen Morrow in a utility room of the laundry facility. On the floor next to the body was a used syringe and a small plastic bag with the remains of a white powder. Medical personnel who arrived at the scene pronounced her dead, preliminarily determining the cause of death as a drug overdose. "I had known this woman for almost 2 years. She seemed together, I guess," Dawson says in an interview for the documentary, his eyes darting around and his fingers tapping nervously on his knee. "You know, every inmate has a story. Ellen didn't seem like a typical drug addict, but prison is a strange place. Sometimes people break down." Ellen Morrow was serving a 5-year sentence for stealing prescription drugs from the hospital where she worked as a nurse. According to official prison records, she was a model prisoner with no disciplinary infractions. She had only 8 months left before her release. Prison Warden Warden Baker called an emergency press conference that same day. "We deeply regret the death of Miss Morrow. Our facility has a strict zero-tolerance policy on drugs, and we conduct regular checks. Unfortunately, contraband sometimes finds its way through even the most secure security systems. We will strengthen our controls and are fully cooperating with the investigation." But not everyone was convinced that Ellen's death was a simple case of overdose. Detective Rachel Diaz of the Riversend Police Department, assigned to the investigation, noted several disturbing details from the outset. "The first thing that caught my attention was the unnatural position of the body," Diaz explains, sitting in her modest office littered with files. "When a person injects a drug and then loses consciousness from an overdose, the body usually falls in a certain way. In Ellen Morrow's case, it looked like someone had carefully laid her on the floor. And then there was the question of where she got the drugs and why she chose a laundry room instead of a more secluded place." Diaz requested a full autopsy report and toxicology report, which were promised to be provided in 2 weeks. In the meantime, she began interviewing staff and inmates who might have known Ellen. Michael Harris, a 42-year-old guard who had worked at Riversend Correctional for the past 15 years, showed an unusual interest in the investigation. He approached Detective Diaz himself after she finished talking to the warden. "I was the last staff member to see her alive," he said, nervously adjusting his uniform shirt. "At around 11 p.m., she asked permission to stay in the laundry room to finish a load of laundry. This was standard practice for inmates with privileges for good behavior. I didn't notice anything unusual." Diaz watched Harris closely during the conversation. Something about his behavior seemed unnatural. Too many details, too much emphasis on how ordinary it was. She made a mental note to check him out more thoroughly. The next conversation with Sarah Wallace, Ellen's cellmate, raised even more questions. Sarah, a former elementary school teacher convicted of embezzling school funds, seemed genuinely shocked by her friend's death. "Ellen didn't do drugs here in prison," she said confidently. "I was with her almost every day for 2 years. She struggled with her addiction and attended support groups. She said prison was her chance to start over. In the last 6 months, Ellen changed. She became more withdrawn and smiled a lot for no reason. I thought she was just happy about being released soon. But there were some strange things. Ellen started getting extra privileges, better jobs, and sometimes she would disappear for hours saying she had been assigned to an extra shift in the laundry or kitchen." When Diaz asked to see Ellen's personal belongings, Sarah pointed to a neatly made bed and a small nightstand. Among the standard prison belongings, the detective found several unusual items: an expensive notebook, clearly of a quality far superior to anything that could be bought in the prison shop, a bottle of relatively expensive perfume, and several premium chocolate bars that were definitely not part of the standard prison shop assortment. "Where did she get these things?" Diaz asked. Sarah shrugged. She never said. "I asked her a couple of times, but she either laughed it off or changed the subject. At some point, I stopped asking." On her way back to the police station, Diaz looked through the initial reports filed by the officers who had arrived at the scene. One detail in particular caught her attention. The surveillance cameras in the hallway leading to the laundry room had been turned off for maintenance on the night of Ellen's death. According to the prison's technical specialist, this was scheduled maintenance that the staff had been notified of in advance. Too many coincidences, Diaz muttered as she entered her office. At that moment, she did not yet know that an investigation had begun that would shake not only the small town of Riversend, but the entire Pennsylvania prison system. The next day, Detective Diaz requested the complete personal files of Ellen Morrow and Michael Harris. Studying the guard shift schedule for the past 6 months, she noticed a pattern. Harris was most often on duty on the days when Ellen worked in the laundry. Coincidence? Diaz didn't believe in such coincidences. Detective Rachel Diaz sat in the county courthouse archives, sifting through documents related to the Ellen Morrow case. The life story of the deceased inmate was gradually coming together, and it was very different from a typical criminal biography. Ellen grew up in a suburb of Pittsburgh, was an honor student in school, and received a scholarship to attend medical college. After graduating as a nurse, she worked in the emergency room at Riversend City Hospital. Her colleagues described her as a dedicated professional, and her patients appreciated her attentiveness and kindness. Everything changed after a car accident. "She broke 3 ribs and suffered a serious back injury," said Ellen's former colleague, Nurse Catherine Jenkins. "The pain was so severe that she couldn't sleep at night. The doctors prescribed oxycodone, and it helped for a while. The addiction developed gradually. When the prescriptions ran out and the back pain returned with any attempt to stop taking the pills, Ellen began stealing medication from hospital supplies. At first, it was 1 or 2 pills, then more and more. She was caught when she forged a doctor's signature on a prescription. "I felt like I was in control," Diaz quoted Ellen's testimony from the court transcript. "I told myself it was temporary, that I could stop. But every time I tried to quit, the reality became unbearable." Diaz leaned back in her chair and rubbed her eyes. It was a familiar story she had heard dozens of times. The opioid epidemic spared no one, not school teachers, doctors, or housewives from affluent families. That same day, Diaz went to the prison to examine visitation records and duty schedules in more detail. She discovered that over the past 6 months, Michael Harris had not only frequently worked the same shifts as Ellen, but had also visited the laundry room block several times during non-working hours. "Reason for visits?" Diaz asked the archive administrator. "Mostly maintenance or unscheduled inspections," the woman replied, pointing to the relevant notes in the log. Diaz raised an eyebrow. "Is he a plumber too? Isn't that the job of the maintenance staff?" The administrator shrugged. "Michael is one of those people who is always willing to help. Sometimes it's easier to ask him to fix a leaky faucet than wait 2 days for a technician to come." Diaz checked the dates and times of these urgent repairs. Interestingly, most of them occurred late in the evening or at night, when only one inmate, Ellen Morrow, was usually working in the laundry room. After lunch, Diaz spent several hours reviewing the files of other inmates who had worked with Ellen. Nothing remarkable, except for one thing. Over the past 6 months, Ellen had gradually been granted more privileges, including extra time for phone calls, working in the more comfortable laundry room instead of cleaning toilets, and an increased limit at the prison store. "Who usually approves such leniency?" Diaz asked Prison Warden Joan Baker. "As a rule, the decision is made by the supervisory board based on recommendations from the guards," Baker replied, clearly unhappy with how long the police had been digging into her institution. "We have a system of rewards for good behavior. It's standard practice. And who specifically recommended Ellen Morrow for these privileges?" Diaz already knew the answer, but she wanted to hear it from Baker. The warden reluctantly looked through the documents. "Mostly Mr. Michael Harris's recommendations. He directly supervised her work in the laundry." Returning to Ellen's cell for a more thorough search, Diaz checked every corner of the small space. Under the mattress, she found something unexpected, a bundle of letters neatly tied with a red hair tie. The letters were unsealed, written on cheap prison paper, and unsigned, but their content left no doubt as to their nature. "I think about you every day. I count the minutes until we meet again. I've never felt anything like this before. I know it's crazy, but I can't stop thinking about you. You gave me hope in this place where there should be none. When you get out, we can start all over again. I'm willing to wait." The handwriting was masculine but deliberately altered, as if the author was trying to hide his identity even in these intimate messages. Diaz carefully placed the letters in an evidence bag. Now she needed samples of Michael Harris's handwriting for comparison. Expanding her circle of interviewees, Diaz spoke with 3 guards who had worked the same shift as Harris. Their opinions were divided. "Mike? Great guy, real professional," said Rick Stevens, a veteran prison officer. "A little quiet, but reliable. You could always count on him." "He's been a little jumpy the last year," disagreed Teresa Martinez, the only woman on their shift. "We used to go out for a beer after work sometimes, but for the last 8 months he's always refused, saying he has to get home early. But one day I saw his car in the prison parking lot when I was leaving after my second shift. He said he'd forgotten his wallet, but it seemed strange to me." The third guard, Jason Walker, was more straightforward. Harris had a special relationship with that inmate, Morrow. "I noticed how he looked at her, how he spoke to her, quieter, softer. Nothing specific that could be called a violation, but something was going on. I didn't want to get involved." After talking to the guards, Diaz asked to meet with Ellen's husband, Robert Morrow, a high school physics teacher. The meeting took place at the Morrows' home, a small, modest house on a quiet street in Riversend. "We were in the process of getting divorced," Robert said, looking past the detective. "After the drug problem started, our marriage was basically over. I tried to help her, tried to get her into rehab, but she always found excuses. When she was arrested, I didn't know what to do. I visited her for the first few months, but it was hard. We gradually grew apart. The last time I saw her was about a year ago." "Did she mention anyone from the prison staff?" Diaz asked. "Maybe she complained about someone, or on the contrary, spoke about someone with particular fondness." Robert shook his head. "She didn't talk much about her life there. She said she was trying to stay out of trouble. She wanted to get her sentence reduced for good behavior." "When was the last time you spoke to her?" 3 months ago. I called her after I filed for divorce. I wanted her to hear it from me, not from a lawyer. She reacted strangely. She was almost happy. She said it was for the best, that she had plans to start a new life after her release. I thought she had finally realized her mistakes and really wanted to change. That evening, Diaz requested access to Ellen's phone records. After listening to hours of monotonous conversations, she finally found what she was looking for. In one of the conversations with her younger sister, Ellen mentioned a certain M, who made her life in prison much easier. "He understands me, Jen. He says he's never met anyone like me. I know how it sounds, but I think it's real." Her sister warned her, "Ellie, you're doing dangerous things. If you get caught..." "I won't get caught. We're careful. And it's not for long. I'll be out in 8 months." "And then what? Do you really think this will work in the real world?" "He says he'll find a way. He'll quit the force if he has to." Diaz paused the recording and made a note in her notebook. Now she had proof of the relationship between the inmate and the guard. Combined with the letters, this was already a solid basis for questioning Harris. The next morning, Diaz received the preliminary results of the toxicology report. Fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine, had indeed been found in Ellen's system. The dose was lethal even for someone with experience using drugs. But one detail caught the detective's attention. The report indicated that traces of an injection had been found on Ellen's right arm, even though all her medical records indicated that she was left-handed. "A left-handed person would hardly shoot themselves in the right arm," Diaz muttered, closing the folder with the report. The picture was becoming increasingly grim. During the investigation, Diaz discovered suspicious patterns in the work schedule of guard Michael Harris, who was often in the laundry room during non-working hours when Ellen was working there. Anonymous love letters written in a man's handwriting were found under Ellen's mattress. Harris's colleagues noted changes in his behavior and his special attitude toward Ellen. In a phone conversation with her sister, Ellen mentioned a certain M, who made her life in prison easier and promised to start a new life with her after her release. A toxicology report confirmed that she died from fentanyl, but a needle mark was found on her right arm, even though Ellen was left-handed, suggesting murder rather than suicide. History. Cold November rain drummed on the roof of Michael Harris's house as Detective Diaz parked her unmarked sedan across the street. She spent nearly an hour in the car, watching the single-story ranch-style house with its neat but clearly neglected lawn. Neighbors described Harris as a quiet man who kept to himself. A typical description of a serial killer, Diaz thought ironically, but she quickly pulled herself together. She had to remain objective. Facts were more important than preconceptions. Diaz had not planned an official visit. This was just reconnaissance. She wanted to see how the man who had become the prime suspect in her investigation lived. 20 minutes after Diaz arrived, a bright red sedan pulled into Harris's driveway. A young woman in her 30s with dark hair pulled back and a messy bun got out of the car. She opened the door with her own key and disappeared inside the house. A few minutes later, the lights came on in the windows. Diaz checked her documents. Liza Harris, 34, wife of Michael, works as a teacher at Riversend Elementary School. Apparently, she had returned from work. An hour later, Michael himself arrived, tired after his shift. Diaz noted the almost complete lack of contact between the couple. No welcoming kiss at the door, not even a hug. They clearly lived under the same roof, but how close they were emotionally was another question. The next day, Diaz officially requested Michael Harris's personnel file from the Correctional Facility's Human Resources Department. The guard's biography looked impeccable. High school in Riversend, 2 years at a community college, then the Army, 4 years in the military police, including a year-long tour in Afghanistan. After leaving the Army in 2008, he returned to his hometown and got a job at the Correctional Facility, where he rose through the ranks from junior guard to senior officer with excellent references. He has been married to Liza Edwards, now Harris, since 2011 and has no children. He has had no disciplinary action taken against him in 15 years of service. He has been named Employee of the Month 3 times. Colleagues described him as a reliable and responsible worker, although they noted his tendency to keep to himself. Diaz visited the local bank where the Harris family had their accounts. With a warrant in hand, she gained access to their financial records for the past year. At first glance, nothing unusual. A modest salary for a prison guard and a teacher, a mortgage, utility bills, groceries. But digging deeper, Diaz discovered an interesting detail. Over the past 6 months, Michael had withdrawn relatively large sums of cash twice, $2,000 each time. The financial documents did not indicate what the money was spent on. On the third day of her investigation, Diaz returned to the prison for a more detailed conversation with Sarah Wallace, Ellen's cellmate. This time, she had prepared more specific questions. "You mentioned strange gifts that Ellen received. Can you tell me more about that?" Diaz asked as they settled into the small interview room. Sarah nervously twirled a plastic cup of water in her hands. "It started about 6 months ago. At first, it was small things. Chocolate bars that aren't available in the prison store, nice shampoo instead of the crappy stuff they give us. Then it got more serious. The notebook you found, expensive perfume. One day she came back from work at the laundry with new underwear. Lace, can you imagine? In prison. I asked her where it all came from and she laughed it off. I have my own Santa Claus." "Did she talk about her relationship with any of the staff?" Sarah shook her head. "Not directly, never. But there were hints. She often said things like, 'Not all guards are heartless robots,' or 'Some people see us as people, not just numbers.' In recent months, she became more secretive, often writing something in that notebook and hiding it immediately if I entered the cell." "What about her disappearances? You mentioned that she was often absent." "Yes, especially in the evenings. She said she was taking extra shifts in the laundry or helping out in the kitchen. But once I saw the work schedule and her name wasn't there. When I asked her, she said it was unofficial work, that the bosses allowed her to work extra hours because of her good behavior." "Did Ellen ever mention Michael Harris?" Sarah didn't answer right away, as if weighing whether to say she never mentioned any names. But about a month ago, in a rare moment of candor, after lights out when we were lying in the dark, she said, "You know, sometimes you meet someone who completely changes your life, even in the most unexpected place." I asked her what she meant, and she replied, "I'm in love, Sarah, for the first time in my life." I assumed it was someone from the letters or phone calls, someone from outside. She laughed and said, "No, it's much closer than you think." We didn't talk about it anymore. After talking to Sarah, Diaz decided to take a look at the laundry room herself, the place where Ellen's body had been found. It was a spacious room with industrial washing machines and dryers, ironing presses, and large tables for sorting laundry. In the far corner was a small utility room where cleaning supplies and equipment were stored. That was where Ellen was found. "Who usually has access to this utility room?" Diaz asked the guard accompanying her. "Only staff and inmates working in the laundry. The door is locked, and the duty guards and the head of housekeeping have spare keys." Diaz carefully examined the room. The utility room was cramped, no more than 3 square meters, with iron shelves along the walls and a small table by the window. The window facing the prison courtyard was barred, but large enough to provide natural light. On one of the shelves, Diaz noticed neatly folded clean towels and sheets, unusually neat for a storage room. "Is it standard practice to fold laundry like this in the storage room?" she asked. The guard looked at the towels in surprise. "No. Usually the clean laundry is sent straight to the living quarters. It's strange that it's here." Diaz put on gloves and carefully moved the stack of laundry. Underneath it was a rolled-up thin mattress, clearly not part of the standard laundry equipment. Next to it stood a soft-lighting electric lamp, and on the table lay a paperback book, Nicholas Sparks' The Notebook. "Looks like someone's made themselves a little nest here," Diaz muttered. Later that day, Diaz met with Jennifer Coleman, Ellen's younger sister. The meeting took place in a small cafe on the outskirts of Riversend. Jennifer, a 30-year-old carbon copy of her older sister, looked exhausted with grief. "We talked every week," she said, stirring her untouched coffee. "After Robert stopped visiting her, I was Ellen's only connection to the outside world. Her parents disowned her after she was arrested. They're very conservative people and thought she had brought shame on the family." "Did Ellen mention her relationship with someone from prison in your conversations?" It was a statement, not a question. Jennifer sighed. "At first I thought it was just fantasy, a way to cope with loneliness. You know, she was always a bit romantic. But then I realized it was serious. She talked about him all the time, though she never mentioned his name, just the first letter, M. She said he understood her like no one else, that they were planning a future together after she was released." "Did she ever express any concerns about the relationship?" "The last time we spoke, it was a week before she died. She seemed agitated, but not in a good way. She said they were having complications. That M had become more nervous, afraid they would be found out. And then she said something that sounds terrible now. 'If anything happens to me, you know where to look.' And where is that?" "In her apartment in Riversend 2, which she shared with Robert. They sold it after she was arrested. But Ellen had a one-room apartment that she rented shortly before her arrest. She continued to pay for it even from prison, which ate up almost all the money I sent her. She said she needed a place to come back to." By evening, Diaz had obtained a search warrant for Ellen's apartment. It was a small studio in an old building not far from the hospital where Ellen had worked before her arrest. The apartment looked abandoned, dust on the furniture, dried up plants on the windowsill, but it was clear that someone had kept it minimally tidy, possibly the landlord. Diaz methodically searched every corner. In the closet, she found several boxes of personal belongings, photographs, diplomas, some souvenirs. In the bathroom, behind a loose tile under the sink, the detective found a waterproof bag with a leather-bound notebook. It was Ellen's diary. The entries began about a year before her arrest and continued until the last week of Ellen's life. Apparently, her sister brought the notebook to the prison and took it back after each visit. Diaz began reading from the end. October 22nd, 2023. M says we need to be more careful. One of the guards has started asking questions about our meetings in the laundry room. I said I didn't care. I was tired of hiding. He got angry, for the first time ever. He said I didn't understand what I was risking. Not just my freedom, but my life. Melodramatic? Yes, but I love that about him. His passion. Everything he does with intense emotion. October 25th, 2023. Today, I told Emir that my period was late, 2 weeks. He turned pale, literally. He asked if I was sure. I said no, but that I had symptoms. He left without even saying goodbye. I think he needs time to process the news. To be honest, I'm in shock too, but it's strange. I don't feel panic, more like hope. This is my chance for a new life. October 29th, 2023. M finally came over to talk. He said we had to get rid of the baby, that it would ruin all our plans, his career, my parole. I said I wanted to keep it. We argued. I'd never seen him like that before. He looked like a cornered animal. When I said I wasn't going to keep quiet about the baby's father if it was a boy, he grabbed me by the shoulders really hard. I was scared he was going to hit me, but then he just left. November 1st, 2023. M came back with a plan. He said he found a doctor who would perform the abortion secretly. This is madness. An underground abortion in prison? I refused. I said that if he didn't accept my decision, I would tell the prison warden everything. Was that low of me? Perhaps, but it's my body and my child. November 3rd, 2023. M agreed to think about the situation, but I can see he's desperate. Today he brought chocolate and apologized for being rude. I'll send Jen for the notebook tonight. I don't want to risk keeping it here. Something tells me I should keep these notes, just in case. The last entry was dated November 3rd, 4 days before Ellen's death. Diaz carefully packed the diary into an evidence bag. It was a breakthrough in the investigation. Meanwhile, the results of the full autopsy confirmed what Ellen had written in her diary. She was pregnant, approximately 6 weeks along. A toxicology analysis also showed that midazolam, a sedative that could have been used to immobilize her before administering a lethal dose of fentanyl, was found in her system. Diaz contacted the hospital pharmacy where Ellen had previously worked. It turned out that in the emergency room, there had been 2 reports of small amounts of medication, including fentanyl, going missing in the last 6 months. In one case, security cameras captured a man in a hoodie entering the staff room using someone else's pass. His face was obscured by the hood, but his build and height matched those of Michael Harris. By the end of the week, Diaz had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to request an arrest warrant for Harris. But she needed more solid evidence to build a strong case. She decided to check the surveillance footage from other parts of the prison on the night Ellen died. A young prison technician named Alex Chen helped her review the archives. The cameras in the hallway outside the laundry room weren't working, but we have footage from the cameras at the main gate between the blocks, he explained as he scrolled through the video. In the footage dated 10:47 p.m., about an hour before Ellen's estimated time of death, Michael Harris was clearly visible walking through the gate with a small bag in his hand. At 11:52 p.m., the camera captured him returning, without the bag and looking visibly disheveled. Can we see the recordings from other days? Diaz asked. From the last, say, 2 weeks before her death? Chen nodded and began scrolling through the archive. It turned out that Harris regularly visited the laundry room late at night when only Ellen was supposed to be working there. These visits became particularly frequent in the last 2 weeks before her death. Did he always go at the same time? Diaz asked. Almost, usually between 10:30 and 11 p.m., staying between 30 minutes and an hour. Diaz made a note in her notebook. What about the other cameras? Are there any recordings from the parking lot or the prison entrance? Chen hesitated. Technically, yes. But you need permission from the prison warden to access those recordings. I have a warrant for all recordings related to the investigation. Diaz showed the document. After half an hour of reviewing the external camera footage, Diaz discovered another interesting detail. Harris often stayed late after his shift ended, clocked out, but did not leave the prison grounds for another hour or 2. His car remained in the parking lot, even though his records showed that he had already finished work. The next day, Diaz met with prison warden Warden Baker. By this point, she had gathered a significant amount of information, but she wanted to know how deeply the prison administration was involved in covering up what was happening. Mrs. Baker, have you ever noticed any unusual behavior on the part of Michael Harris toward inmate Morrow? Diaz asked, watching the warden's reaction. Baker kept a straight face. Mr. Michael Harris is a model employee with an impeccable record. I haven't noticed anything inappropriate in his interactions with inmates. What about the frequent incidents of surveillance cameras being turned off in the laundry room? According to the records, the cameras there have been repaired or serviced 12 times in the last 6 months. Is that a normal frequency? Baker frowned slightly. We have old equipment, Detective. Budget constraints prevent us from completely upgrading the video surveillance system. Still, it's a strange coincidence that the cameras most often malfunctioned on the days when Harris and Morrow were in the laundry room at the same time. What are you trying to say, Detective Diaz? Baker's voice grew noticeably colder. I'm trying to understand whether you knew about the romantic relationship between your employee and the inmate, and if so, what you did about it. Baker lost her composure for a moment. That's an absurd accusation. Such a thing is not tolerated in my institution. And yet I have proof. Letters, Ellen's diary, phone records, eyewitness accounts. Ellen and Michael were in a relationship for at least 6 months. What's more, Ellen was pregnant, presumably by Harris, and I believe that's why she was killed. Baker's face changed color. She clearly hadn't expected this much information. I didn't know about the pregnancy. I had received anonymous reports about a possible inappropriate relationship, and I was planning an internal investigation, but everything happened before I could. Can you provide these anonymous reports? Baker nodded. They're in my office. 2 notes left in the suggestion and complaint box. No signature. Diaz received the notes an hour later. Both were typed with no personal details and contained roughly the same text. Check on guard Harris and inmate Morrow, especially the evening shifts in the laundry. By the end of the week, Diaz had gathered enough evidence to piece together a preliminary timeline of events. Michael Harris and Ellen Morrow had begun their relationship about 6 months before her death. Harris had been protecting Ellen, providing her with privileges and small contraband items. They met regularly in the laundry room, which Harris had turned into a makeshift hideout. When Ellen became pregnant, the situation escalated dramatically. Harris, fearing exposure and the loss of his job, possibly even criminal prosecution, insisted that she have an abortion. Ellen refused. According to her diary entries, she threatened to reveal their relationship if he did not help her get parole and acknowledge the child. On the night of November 7th, Harris came to the laundry, presumably for a final conversation. What exactly happened in that back room remains unknown, but the outcome was tragic. Ellen was first sedated with midazolam and then killed with a lethal dose of fentanyl. Harris staged an overdose, leaving a syringe and a bag of drugs next to the body, which he had probably stolen from the hospital. There was one important witness left, whom Diaz had not yet interviewed, Harris's wife, Liza. Perhaps she knew something or had noticed changes in her husband's behavior. Diaz decided to visit her the next day when Michael was on duty. Liza Harris opened the door after the 3rd ring. She looked tired, with dark circles under her eyes. Upon learning that the visitor was from the police, the woman showed no surprise, rather a sense of doom. "I've been expecting you," she said, leading Diaz into the living room. It had to happen sooner or later. Diaz looked around carefully. The room was clean but lifeless. No family photos or personal items that usually fill a home. It was like a transit point, not a place where people lived. "Do you know why I'm here?" Diaz asked. Liza nodded. "Because of that woman in prison. Because of her and Michael." "How long have you known?" "I've suspected it for several months. I knew for sure about 2 months ago when I found someone else's perfume on his shirt. He didn't try very hard to hide it. Coming home late, mysterious phone calls, suddenly needing to be alone." Liza spoke in a monotone, as if she were talking about the weather rather than the collapse of her marriage. "Did you talk to him about it?" "Once. He denied everything, of course. He said I was paranoid that work was wearing him out, but I saw how he had changed. Michael had always been secretive, but not like this. Obsessed. The last few months, it was like he was living in another world." "What about the night of November 7th? Do you remember what time he came home?" Liza paused for a moment. "That was the night I was staying with my sister in Pittsburgh. She had just had a baby, and I went to help her. Michael was supposed to join me the next day, but he called in the morning and said he couldn't make it because of an urgent situation at work." "Do you have any messages or records of those calls?" "No, but my sister can confirm that I was at her house and Michael never showed up." Diaz made a note in her notebook. "Mrs. Harris, you mentioned earlier that you were expecting me. Why?" Liza stood up and walked over to the dresser. She took an envelope out of the bottom drawer. "Because I sent those anonymous notes to the prison warden. And because on the night that woman died, Michael came home at dawn. I arrived earlier than I had planned. He was in a panic. and threw his clothes in the washing machine right away. I'd never seen him so scared before. She handed the envelope to Diaz. Here are photos of his shirt before it was washed. I took them while he was in the shower. I don't know if it will help, but there were stains. They looked like blood. 2 hours later, Diaz received a search warrant for the Harris home. Forensic experts thoroughly searched every corner, paying particular attention to the washing machine and Michael's clothes. Despite thorough washing, microscopic traces of blood were found on the lining of the jacket Harris wore on the night of the murder. A DNA test confirmed that the blood belonged to Ellen. In the garage, under some plywood sheets, the team found a small box. Inside were personal items: a photograph of Ellen, apparently taken secretly in the prison cafeteria, several notes written in her hand, and a scarf with the scent of the same perfume found in the cell. He kept souvenirs, Diaz noted as she examined the finds. Classic behavior. Meanwhile, handwriting experts confirmed that the anonymous love letters found in Ellen's cell had been written by Michael, despite his attempts to change his handwriting. The next step was a visit to the hospital where Ellen had worked before her arrest. Diaz wanted to confirm the connection between the theft of the medication and Harris. After reviewing surveillance footage from the days when the thefts occurred, she finally got a clear picture. One of the recordings showed a man who looked very much like Michael walking through the service entrance using a pass. The pass, it turned out, belonged to a former orderly who had been fired a week earlier. The orderly confirmed that he had lost his pass and received a new one. By the end of the day, Diaz had enough evidence to make an arrest. She requested a warrant and drove to the prison where Harris was finishing his day shift. Michael Harris did not look surprised when Diaz read him his rights. He allowed himself to be handcuffed without protest and remained calm during the ride to the police station. It was only when they were in the interrogation room that his facade began to crack. "You don't understand," he said when Diaz laid out photos, letters, and lab test results in front of him. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is, Michael," Diaz said, turning on the tape recorder. "Tell me your side of the story." Harris ran his hand over his face. "We loved each other. It started by accident. I helped her after another inmate hit her. We started talking. She was different from the others. Educated, smart. She understood me. And you started dating in the laundry room." "Yes. At first we just talked. Then everything changed. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. She made me feel alive for the first time in years." "What happened on the night she died, Michael?" Harris was silent for a long time, staring at the table. "She said she was pregnant. At first I didn't believe her. I thought she was manipulating me. But then I realized it was true. I panicked. If it came out, I would lose everything. My job, my freedom. I suggested she get rid of the baby. And she refused. Yes, she said she wanted to keep it, that it was our chance for a new life." Harris smiled bitterly. "What kind of life? I'm a former prison guard who was fired for having a relationship with an inmate, possibly under investigation. She's an ex-convict with a drug conviction. What kind of future does a family like that have?" "So you decided to get rid of the problem?" "No. I mean, I didn't want to kill her. I just wanted her to agree to an abortion. That night I brought the drugs from the hospital, enough to cause a miscarriage, but not enough to kill her. I wanted to slip them into her tea. But something went wrong." Harris nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "She figured it out. She saw the bag of pills. We argued. She screamed that she hated me, that she would tell everyone. I tried to calm her down, but she pushed me away and hit her head on the shelf. Not badly, but she was bleeding. She threatened to report me for assault, that I would never see my child again." Diaz watched Harris closely. "And then you decided to put her to sleep?" "Yes, I gave her a sedative. I wanted her to just fall asleep so I could leave and figure out what to do next. But I didn't calculate the dose correctly. She passed out almost immediately. Her breathing became irregular. I panicked. And instead of calling for medical help, you decided to finish what you started." Harris covered his face with his hands. "I didn't know what to do. If she had been saved, she would have told everything. I can't explain what happened to me. It was like I was watching myself from the outside. I took the fentanyl and finished it. Then I staged an overdose. I knew she had a history of opioid abuse. I thought everyone would believe it. But you didn't take into account that she was left-handed. Harris looked up, surprise in his eyes. What? Ellen was left-handed. The needle mark was on her right arm. A left-handed person would never shoot up their right arm. Harris's shoulders slumped. He looked completely broken. I didn't think of that. I wasn't thinking straight at the time. That evening, reviewing the interrogation transcript, Diaz reconstructed the chronology of Ellen Morrow's last day. According to documents and witness statements, the day began as usual. Ellen had breakfast in the prison cafeteria, then worked her morning shift in the kitchen. After lunch, she had some free time, which, according to her cellmate, she spent writing another letter, presumably to Michael. In the evening, Ellen began her shift in the laundry room. At approximately 10:30 p.m., according to surveillance camera footage, Michael Harris entered the laundry room. By that time, all the other workers had already gone to their cells, leaving Ellen alone. Only 2 people knew exactly what happened in that utility room, and one of them will never tell her side of the story. But physical evidence confirmed the basic outline. An argument, a physical struggle. Ellen's blood was found not only on Harris's clothes, but also on a shelf. Then the administration of a sedative, and finally, a lethal dose of fentanyl. Harris left the body, staging an overdose, and left the prison. He threw away the remaining drugs on his way home, but kept Ellen's personal belongings. Typical behavior for someone who cannot completely let go of their victim, even after their death. Diaz sighed heavily as she closed the case file. The tragedy could have been avoided if someone had responded to the anonymous messages earlier, if the prison surveillance system had worked properly, if... Too many ifs. The evening before the trial, Diaz visited Sarah Wallace in prison. The inmate handed her a thin notebook. Ellen gave this to me the day before. It happened. She told me to keep it and not show it to anyone except her sister or the police if anything happened to her. I was afraid to give it away earlier. I thought I would be accused of complicity. It turned out to be Ellen's personal diary, which she had kept in prison, unlike the one stored in her apartment. It contained much more detail about her relationship with Harris, her plans for the future after her release, and most importantly, a description of her fears in her final days. November 3rd. Michael is becoming increasingly unstable. Today he suggested solving the problem with pills. He said he knows people at the hospital. I refused and threatened to tell on us if he kept pressuring me. That was a mistake. I saw something in his eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Coldness, calculation. He said, "You don't understand what I'm capable of." For the first time ever, I was truly scared. November 5th. I gave Jen the main diary during my visit. I'll leave this one with Sarah just in case. I'm starting to think Michael might be dangerous. Today he was strangely calm, almost detached. He said he accepted my decision and would support whatever I chose. I don't believe him. Something's wrong. This isn't like him. He's planning something. November 6th. We're meeting at the laundromat tomorrow. Michael says he wants to discuss the future, that he's found a way for us to be together without ruining his career. I don't know if I should believe him. Just in case, I told Sarah where to find my diaries if anything happens to me. I'm probably being paranoid, but it's better to be safe than sorry. If you're reading this and I'm gone, don't let him get away with it. The last entry was cut off mid-sentence. Diaz closed the notebook, feeling heavy-hearted. Ellen had sensed danger, but she went to the meeting anyway, perhaps hoping that her fears were unfounded, that the man she had fallen in love with was incapable of murder. That notebook was the final nail in the coffin of Harris's defense. The entry from November 6th clearly showed that Ellen feared for her life on the eve of her death, which completely contradicted Harris's version of a spontaneous quarrel with tragic consequences. This was premeditated murder, carefully planned by a man who decided that Ellen's death was the easiest way to solve their shared problem. February 18, 2024, Riversend County Court. The courtroom was packed with journalists, local residents, prison staff, and law enforcement officers. The Michael Harris case had become the most high-profile case in the small town's history in decades. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Richard Montgomery, presented overwhelming evidence of Harris's guilt: physical evidence, surveillance footage, witness testimony, expert reports, Ellen's diaries, and finally, the defendant's own confession. Detective Rachel Diaz was a key witness for the prosecution. Her methodical, detailed account of the investigation and the evidence gathered left no room for doubt. The defendant, Michael Harris, engaged in a relationship with inmate Ellen Morrow that was prohibited by law and prison rules, Diaz said confidently as she stood before the jury. When this relationship resulted in pregnancy and Miss Morrow refused to have an abortion, the defendant, fearing exposure and criminal prosecution, deliberately took her life with a lethal dose of fentanyl, which he had illegally obtained himself. The defense, represented by attorney James Foster, attempted to argue that the killing was unintentional and committed in the heat of the moment. "My client did make a terrible mistake, giving in to momentary panic and fear," Foster argued, "but he never planned to kill Miss Morrow. This was a tragic accident, not a cold-blooded murder." However, Ellen's diaries, especially her last entries, where she expressed fear for her life on the eve of her death, refuted the defense's version. In addition, medical experts confirmed that death from a fentanyl overdose after the administration of a sedative could not have been accidental. It required consistent, deliberate actions. The testimony of Liza Harris became a key moment in the trial. Despite the divorce initiated immediately after her husband's arrest, she agreed to testify. On the night Ellen Morrow died, Michael came home at dawn, Liza said quietly, avoiding looking at her ex-husband. He was agitated, scared. He immediately jumped into the shower and then washed his clothes, even though he had never done that before. I noticed blood stains on his shirt and took photos. I suspected something terrible had happened. "Why didn't you go to the police right away?" asked the prosecutor. "I was afraid. I didn't know what to do. So I sent anonymous notes to the prison warden, hoping that someone would start an investigation. When I found out about the woman's death, I realized I was too late." On the last day of the trial, Jennifer Coleman, Ellen's sister, was given the floor. She talked about what Ellen was like before her addiction, about her desire to start a new life after her release, and about her plans to return to her nursing career. "Ellen made a mistake by giving in to her addiction, and she paid for it by serving time," Jennifer said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But she didn't deserve to die like that. She deserved a second chance, and her unborn child deserved a chance at life." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. Judge Elizabeth Parker announced the sentence: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. "Michael Harris," she said, looking at the defendant, "you did not simply take a life. You betrayed the trust placed in you as an officer of the law. You used your position to exploit a vulnerable person, and then you killed her to cover up your actions. The justice system cannot and will not tolerate such betrayal." As the guards led Harris out of the courtroom, Detective Diaz noticed that he did not look broken or remorseful, but rather empty, like a man who had lost everything, including the ability to feel. After the trial ended, the investigation did not stop. The State Commission on Correctional Oversight launched an investigation into the Riversend Women's Prison. The results were grim: inadequate staff supervision, a faulty video surveillance system, and a disregard for potential signs of inappropriate relationships between staff and inmates. Warden Baker, the prison warden, resigned after the commission's report was published. 2 other guards were fired for negligence and failure to follow protocols. The entire security system of the facility was reorganized. New surveillance cameras were installed, and stricter measures were introduced to monitor staff interactions with inmates. The Ellen Morrow case was a catalyst for broader reforms in the state's prison system. A new, single reporting protocol was introduced for reports of staff misconduct. Protections for inmates who report violations were strengthened, and funding for mental health programs for both inmates and staff was significantly increased. A year after the verdict, on a cold February day, Detective Rachel Diaz stood in front of a small headstone in the Riversend City Cemetery. Engraved on the stone were the words, "Ellen Morrow, 1988 to 2023, and below, "Everyone deserves a second chance." Jennifer Coleman, standing next to Diaz, laid a bouquet of white lilies at the base of the stone. "Thank you for coming," she said to the detective. And thank you for everything you did to find the truth." "It's my job," Diaz replied. "How are things now?" "Trying to move on. I started the Ellen Foundation to support women suffering from opioid addiction. I want her story to help others avoid the same fate." They stood there for a moment, the silence broken only by the rustling of the wind in the bare tree branches. Then Jennifer took an envelope out of her bag. "Here, I wanted you to see this. It came to my address 2 weeks ago." Diaz opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from the State Committee on Prison Reform. It stated that the new protocol for protecting prisoners from sexual exploitation by staff, introduced after Ellen's case, had been officially named the Morrow Protocol. "Her death wasn't in vain," Jennifer said quietly. "She changed the system. Maybe it will save someone in the future." Diaz nodded, remembering all the details of the investigation, all the small clues that, when pieced together, had led to justice. Her job was to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. And in Ellen Morrow's case, the victim's voice had been heard. Sarah Wallace was released on parole 6 months after Harris's trial. Her testimony and cooperation with the investigation played an important role in the review of her case. She began working at a rehabilitation center for former inmates, helping other women adjust to life on the outside. Liza Harris left Riversend shortly after the trial. Rumor has it that she moved to the West Coast, changed her last name, and started a new life, trying to distance herself from the nightmare she had been forced into. Michael Harris served his sentence in a maximum security prison in the northern part of the state. Ironically, the man who once guarded prisoners became one himself. According to prison records, he was withdrawn, rarely interacted with other inmates, and did not participate in rehabilitation programs. His only regular activity was writing letters, but no one knew who they were addressed to, as they were never sent. The small town of Riversend gradually recovered from the shock of the tragedy. The story of Ellen Morrow and Michael Harris became a local legend, a warning about the dangers of crossing certain boundaries, about how one wrong decision can lead to irreversible consequences. For Detective Rachel Diaz, the case became one of the most significant of her career. It reminded her why she had chosen this path, not for fame or recognition, but to restore balance, so that even the most vulnerable members of society could count on justice. Returning to her car after visiting Ellen's grave, Diaz reflected on how thin the line is between love and obsession, between passion and control. Michael Harris may have truly loved Ellen in his own way, but that love was distorted by the power he had over her, by his fear of losing control. Diaz knew that in her line of work, there were no perfect endings, only approximations of justice. But in Ellen Morrow's case, the system had worked. The guilty had been punished, lessons learned, reforms initiated, and somewhere in that chain of events was a small victory. Not enough to bring a life back, but enough to give meaning to its loss. As she got into her car, Diaz took one last look at the cemetery. Snow began to fall, covering the ground with a thin white blanket, as if trying to hide all traces of the past. But some stories cannot be buried or forgotten. They live on, reminding us of the price of our choices and the value of the truth, no matter how painful it may be.